Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Drafts and Mail Butler. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, the editor-in-chief of MacStories.net, Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hey, John, how's it going?
Oh, it's going really well. How about you?
It's been a fine week here in Rome, and we're getting ready to announce some pretty cool things on MacStories next week, so it's going to be fun.
It's going to be a lot of fun. So today we're going to talk about what I think is going to end up being a recurring theme and a multi-part series on App Stories, which is monetizing apps and various business models and payment schemes and that sort of thing. And today we thought we'd talk about subscriptions.
Yes, because since the beginning of the App Store, really, developers have been able to monetize their apps by selling them at a fixed price upfront and doing a commission split with Apple of 70% goes to the developer and 30% goes to Apple. And over the years of MacStories, we covered really hundreds, I want to say thousands, maybe not thousands, but really a lot of paid apps on iOS and on macOS. It's been an incredibly popular business model, and it's been adopted by thousands of productivity apps, utilities, games, anything. And those productivity apps, they tend to be what we like to cover. And usually, since 2008, 2009, when we started MacStories, doing the paid app on the App Store used to be the business model for developers. And in the early days of the App Store, this allowed developers to build sustainable businesses that were based on the model explored back in the days of desktop computers and shareware software. You go on a website and you pay for an app, and you now own this app. And the App Store was different, prices were lower, but the idea was the same. You go there, you have a paid app, you purchase the app, now the app is yours and you can use it forever. But as the App Store reached a bigger scale, and Apple introduced in-app purchases in 2009, and developers started experimenting with freemium apps or free apps supported by advertisements or even apps supported by in-app purchases, the situation kind of changed.
That's right. I mean, I don't know when it was. I guess in-app purchases came in 2009. And ever since, the App Store has been dominated by the free apps, as you said. I mean, we looked up some statistics, and it's really kind of remarkable. When you look at the statistics, the top 10 publishers control 67% of the revenue in the App Store and the Google Play Store. That's from one of these Sensor Tower reports that came out. It's really kind of remarkable how concentrated the money on the App Store has become. It's dominated predominantly by game makers, although we've got Netflix in there. Netflix is the one non-game app that was in the top grossing app in the first quarter of 2017. And we rarely these days see indie games getting into any of those either top paid or top grossing charts. We used to see that fairly frequently in the early days, but that has become less and less frequent as the years have gone by. And so this has really required people to change their strategies, especially indie developers that run small shops and build different kinds of businesses around their apps. And one of those is subscriptions, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Right. And especially because there's so much competition when it comes to free apps. Now, suddenly you're no longer choosing between 10 of the same utilities. You have to choose between 1,000 of the same category of apps. And so developers need to, especially the ones that want to build a sustainable business on the App Store, need a way to reach customers and to retain those customers and to sort of have a predictable revenue stream over the years, over time. And so last year, ahead of WWDC, actually, Apple announced some major changes to how developers could monetize their apps using auto-renewable subscriptions on iOS. The auto-renewable subscription was not a new feature of the App Store. It used to be available to entertainment-type apps and sort of magazines and newspapers. But last year, Apple announced that now all categories of apps and all types of apps could use subscriptions, and they were no longer limited to entertainment types or magazines. All developers could use them with a twist. For the first year, the developer would pay out automatically the same commission of the previous business models. So 70% goes to the developer, 30% goes to Apple. But the new thing was, if you retain a customer for a full year as a paying subscriber, the second year, the commission for the developer increases. So now the developer gets 85% and only 15% goes to Apple. And this is a major feature for developers who want to build a sustainable business on the App Store, because it means now you're no longer focusing necessarily on chasing new users, finding new customers, and going for high download numbers. But it means you can also focus on retaining the customers that you already have and making the app better for existing users, supporting the app over time for existing users, so you can generate revenue from people who already know your app and who want to support you. And there are many features, there's going to be links in the show notes, but there are many features available to developers and available to users to manage subscriptions. For example, there's a 60-day grace period. So if a customer cannot remain a subscriber for 2 months during the year, Apple is going to count that as a grace period. Subscriptions can have free trials, and there's a whole interface to manage subscriptions on iOS and on macOS. So it's not like a limited system. Apple has actually built a very serious and very powerful infrastructure for developers. They can do upgrades, they can do cross-grades, they can do different tiers of pricing for subscribers over time. And it's definitely one of the most important and powerful features in terms of building business on the App Store that Apple has released in the past few years.
Well, that's right. And the thing is, though, that there are some limitations. And I think these are the kind of limitations that have caused us to see maybe a little slower growth in subscriptions than we first anticipated. Because I know when you and I were in WWDC last year, there was a lot of excitement about subscriptions, and a lot of people were considering them for their apps. And I know going into research for this show, we were wondering, what really is the magnitude of subscriptions? And I think it's been held back a little bit, at least in with certain kinds of apps, maybe the productivity and utility type apps, because of Rule 3.1.2a of the app review guidelines. That's probably not one that comes right off tip of your tongue or off the top of your head, but that says that if you're changing an existing app to a subscription-based business model, you can't take away primary functionality existing users already have paid for. So what that really means is you can't peel out features and make them paid features. As a result, I think what we've seen when we did some of the research is we've seen new apps that are doing premium features, and we're also seeing some existing apps that are expanding their feature set and making those premium subscription features. But we haven't seen quite as many as I expected to immediately, simply because people can't take things away. And I was curious, so I asked around because I was curious whether being able to create these premium feature subscriptions was resulting in low-cost subscriptions, the kind of thing that I know I had considered myself for Blink, which would be some feature set that might be only a few dollars a year, just as a way to support a new feature or support ongoing development. And I found some, but not a lot. And one of the most interesting I found was Carrot Weather, because Carrot Weather has an Apple Watch complication, and it's a $2.50 subscription that was born out of necessity because Brian Mueller, the developer, pays for access to the weather API he uses for the app, and the Apple Watch pings that API a lot more frequently than his iOS app does. So he used a subscription in order to help pay for that feature, and I think it's been pretty successful. 1Password does something a little bit similar in that they have an Apple Watch app, but it can only be enabled if you're a paying subscriber, and their subscriptions you can purchase either through the App Store or on their website. And another good example was Stamp Pack. It's a sticker app on the iMessage store, but it's also an iOS app. Mm-hmm. And on iOS, you can create your own stamps, your own stamp stickers with your own text in them if you pay a premium subscription, which is $2. Yeah, it's $2 a year to get that. And I talked to the team behind it, and they've been very happy with how it's gone, which leads me to think that maybe more people should try this, in that they've only been doing it for about 5 months, but initially they saw about 25% of their users buy the premium subscription, and that settled down to around 10% or so. But that's a pretty good attach rate for something that's a free download with a subscription available. And a couple others that are interesting. One is Fiery Feeds, which is $2 for a 3-month subscription or $5 for a yearly subscription. That'll give you feed management, URL schemes, email templates, and text view mode, which are all kind of power user features. I think that fits really well with the model. And Parcel, which is a competitor to an app like Deliveries, which is a paid upfront app. But Parcel, which is a relatively new app, is $2.99 per year. Thanks to Drafts for sponsoring App Stories this week. Drafts is where text starts. What do I mean by that? Well, instead of fretting over which app to open, When you have some text to write, open Drafts. Drafts from developer Agile Tortoise is about quick and easy capture on the iPhone, Apple Watch, and iPad. Once your text is in Drafts, you can use its highly customizable actions to send it almost anywhere. Drafts integrates with workflow and launcher apps like Launch Center Pro and Launcher, and has an extensive URL scheme for interacting with other apps. The only limit to the power of Drafts export actions is your own imagination. Text can be sent to social media apps, appended to a journal or other text file in Dropbox, turned into lists for Apple's Reminders app or third-party task managers, or sent as email or text messages to a predefined group of people. The list just goes on and on. One of the coolest recent additions to Drafts is enhanced dictation features. There's a bunch of ways to jump into dictation mode, including from Drafts widget and its Apple Watch app. It's amazingly accurate and a great way to record thoughts on the go. Also, be sure to check out the great screencast series that David Sparks of MacSparky.com did for Drafts. There's a link in the show notes, and it's a great way to get started with the app. To learn more, go to agiletortoise.com/drafts, which will also link in the show notes. Thanks again to Drafts for sponsoring App Stories.
So in addition to the limitations of subscriptions, there's also the bigger argument against them, which is that not a lot of users want to subscribe to every app that they use, and not a lot of developers want to sort of embrace this new business model of doing subscriptions instead of paid upfront apps or in-app purchases. Some customers just don't want to subscribe to all of the apps that they use on a recurring basis. They don't like the idea of not owning an app forever, or at least in the current version. And even if you consider some organizations, they don't allow their employees to sign up for subscriptions. They want to make sure that they can get an app at a volume discount, for example. And the problem here is that for some users, I think software, if you don't pay for a subscription, often it just stops working. The subscription expires and you no longer can use an app that you rely on with your team or as an individual. And I think there can also be, if you consider the problem of if multiple apps are now switching to subscriptions, eventually there's going to be some kind of subscription fatigue, which is, it used to be simpler in the old days. A lot of people would say, I would just go to the App Store and buy an app and that's it. Now I gotta keep in mind that every month I have this $2, $5, $10 that I'm subscribing to and that I'm paying off to developers, and I'm not comfortable with it. And I hear these arguments from a lot of people writing at Mac Stories now that there's more apps doing subscriptions. I understand the argument, and I think it's something that developers should consider if they want to embrace these new models on the App Store.
Right. I think for me that the bottom line is that subscriptions are not a silver bullet. They're just another alternative. I think they're a very good alternative for a lot of developers, and there's a lot of promise there. But it's not like Apple came in and said, "Oh, we fixed it. Everything's going to be a subscription now." You can still do a paid upfront app or a free app or a freemium app or an in-app purchase. You can do all those things. And I think it's good that we've got now an additional choice, because I think it's the kind of choice that fits well with a lot of particularly pro apps and things that people use to get work done and do their business. But I also feel by the same token that it doesn't entirely solve the problem. And I think Apple ought to stay open, if they can, to additional models down the road as we continue to explore how subscriptions fit into things. I mean, I think for me, the trickiest part about subscriptions is that they almost base the value not so much on the app itself, but on how the user uses it. Because, for instance, I know you and I use Ulysses every single day for hours and hours a day.
Right.
And I'm sure that either one of us would be happy to subscribe to that because it's integral to what we do every day. But it's not for everybody. It might be, and someone might own Ulysses and only use it every couple of weeks. And would they want to pay? I mean, it depends what they would set the subscription at, but would they want to pay a subscription for that? And then you look at the fact that Ulysses isn't the only text editor I use. I mean, maybe I have a problem like my 537 apps.
Yes, you do. Yes.
But I use a lot of different text editors for different things. I mean, I use IA Writer sometimes. I use Drafts. I use Byword. I use Textastic. I use a bunch of different text editors for different things, depending on how I feel and what I'm doing. But I'll tell you, I wouldn't pay a subscription for every single one of them because I just don't use all of them enough to make that worth it to me. So I think that's the tricky part for developers, is to figure out, by going down a subscription route, and especially depending on where you set that price, are you leaving too many potential users behind for the promise of recurring revenue? And would you be better off with something that's just plain paid up front?
Right. And I think if you look at Apple, if you look at the statements from Phil Schiller recently, I think we're definitely going to see a rise in the adoption of subscriptions from iOS and Mac developers. As you mentioned, at WWDC last year, we talked to many developers who were excited by the idea. At the time, it was a new change in policy from Apple, and a lot of developers were excited. They wanted to implement subscriptions, and they were curious about this new system that Apple had. And I was at the session at WWDC for subscriptions, and it was packed. And there were a lot of people taking notes about the changes coming to iTunes Connect and how subscriptions work for users. But over the past year, I thought maybe the reaction to subscriptions was great, but in practice, I'm not seeing a lot of subscriptions in the apps that I use on a daily basis. And I thought the reaction has been kind of muted. There haven't been many high-profile subscription-based apps. So I did some research and I asked on Twitter, and I actually discovered a lot of interesting examples of iOS apps doing subscriptions. They are not the usual suspects. They're not the usual names that you see mentioned on Mac Stories or other Apple blogs, but I think they are setting an example for how indie developers are trying their hand at subscriptions and how maybe we should prepare for even more subscriptions in the future. So I collected some of these apps, and I know John and I have been taking notes about this. So here's some of them. So I thought I would start with Bear. Bear, I mentioned on Mac Stories last year. It's a popular and excellent note-taking app that combines the polish of Apple Notes with the power user features of Markdown and automation. Bear came out in November, and it was maybe the first high-profile app, a new app launch to right from the first version to have subscriptions. There's a monthly one, which is $149 per month, and there's an annual one, which is $14.99, so $15 a year, to access the full version of Bear, which unlocks sync, multiple themes, and the advanced export features, which include rich text, docx, HTML, and even JPEG, if you want to export some text to JPEG. And I think this is one of the finest examples of this new way forward of subscriptions. Once you subscribe, it works on Mac, it works on iOS, you get the same quote-unquote account, even if it's actually based on your iTunes account, you don't have to create a new one from scratch. And something interesting to notice is that if you subscribe weekly, you get the first time you try Bear, you get a free 1-week trial. But if you subscribe annually, and you commit to the annual subscription, you get a free 1-month trial. So I think this is an interesting example of subscriptions on iOS and macOS.
Right. And another really nice one is App in the Air, which is a flight tracker app. I've looked at this in the past, and this is probably the best flight tracker app out there, one of the best that I've seen, especially since Flight Tracker stopped being sold on the App Store a few months ago. It's a good example of the variety of things you can do with subscriptions because it's got a little bit of everything. I mean, it's the same sort of model where buying the subscription gives you all sorts of premium features like additional flight information, real-time stats, an offline mode. I don't know. It also lets your family subscribe to your flight so they can see how you're doing and when you arrive at a place, that sort of thing. But there's a whole menu of different subscriptions you can do. You can pay $4.99 a month. You can pay $29.99 a year, and if you do the annual subscription, you get a 2-week free trial. Or you can even do a lifetime, which is $49.99, a lifetime or until the app goes away, I suppose. But it also accounts for people who are infrequent travelers, who maybe aren't business travelers, but still like to have all of this additional information. And you can buy a package of just 5 flights for $4.99, which is really nice if you maybe just want to use it for the occasional vacation or something like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another app that I discovered and that I actually covered on Canvas on Real FM last week, it's called Outlinely. It's an outliner for iOS and macOS. It's a relatively new entry in this space, and it kind of reminds me of Ulysses and Bear mixed with Taskpaper and other text editors. It's kind of nice. Anyway, it's got a similar model to Bear, which is You can subscribe to the Pro feature for $15 a year. There's no monthly subscription. You can only do the annual one. And if you subscribe to the Pro version, you get sync, you get themes, and advanced export features, plus search, full document text search, full screen mode, and even a focus mode to focus in on the current paragraph. And I see a common trend here, which is a lot of these iOS apps are using subscriptions to let you unlock additional features such as iCloud sync or like export options that don't make the primary functionality of the app go away. Instead, they just let you unlock additional stuff to make the app even better.
Right. And I think we see that with a lot of these apps and even the ones that have the small annual subscriptions that I mentioned earlier. I think the tricky part too here is just making sure as a developer where you draw that line, because it's I think it would be easy to pull too much functionality into the premium category and then make it less useful for someone who wants to just use the free version or the non-subscription version of the app. Another interesting app is Remotely. So this is for getting into your Mac on your iOS device remotely. And it has a couple of different subscriptions. It's got a $2.99 a month subscription and a $29.99 a year. If you don't buy the subscription, you have access to your documents folder on your Mac, but no other files. And if you pay for the subscription, you have access to all the files, which I think is kind of a nice way to do it, because by having access to your documents folder, if that's where you store most of your documents, you'll have a lot of the functionality right there. And it's a nice little way to get used to the app and see if it's the kind of thing that works for you. But for instance, I do use my documents folder, but I also have a lot of things in places like Dropbox. And so the subscription would be valuable to someone like me. So I thought that was an interesting way to approach it.
Yeah, that's very clever. Now, for something completely different, John, we're going to talk about zombies. There's this app called Zombies Run, which is a kind of a game mixed with a fitness app, with a running app. I think he started as a Kickstarter campaign, but the idea is you go for a run, you connect your headphones, and you listen to these stories about zombies chasing you. So you need to run, because otherwise you're going to be quote unquote dead and killed by the zombies. And there's a, yeah, I know. And there's a whole community of users behind this app. It's like 1 million users, 1 million players to date.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's an amazing idea, really, combining the fitness tracker with the running GPS features and the story mode aspect. And I was chatting with the developers on Twitter about this idea of a gamified, if you will, audiobook with zombies and exercises. And apparently they're now at, as I mentioned, 1 million players, over 200 missions. There's a story mode, and there's even a membership now. So the membership is based on a subscription. It's $3 a month or $20 a year. And the developers told me on Twitter that the annual option is actually going really well for them. And a lot of the users that try the app want to remain and get more missions and get more stories so they can run from the zombies. And I think this is such an original idea of combining the best features of the iPhone, which is you can take it with you for a run. You can listen in maybe with the AirPods wirelessly, but then you can also be a member and you can remove ads. You can unlock all of the missions. You can unlock interval training, full stats, and many other options and settings. So this is one of the most innovative systems, and definitely one that was helped by Apple bringing subscriptions to all categories of apps on the App Store.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of how DLC works on things like, the PS4. That's interesting.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. The next app I wanted to mention is AstroPad Studio. We've covered AstroPad before on Mac Stories, and if you get AstroPad Standard, I think that's a $30 app. It lets your iPad become a second screen for your Mac, and access and interact with your Mac apps using your iPad. And that works really well, just that way. But if you're an artist, you can subscribe to AstroPad Studio, which takes it up a notch. For $65 a year, you get unlimited gestures, shortcuts, you get pressure smoothing, you get pencil support, and it's iPad Pro only. It's definitely a product that's made specifically for artists using apps like Illustrator and other things to do drawing. And the demos of it are really, really phenomenal. And it just shows that subscriptions are a great way, I think, to really attract a pro market, which this is definitely geared towards.
The last app that I have, it's called Manifest. It's a time tracker for iPhone and iPad that I recently discovered. And it doesn't integrate with the time trackers that I usually talk about, the MacStories and Club MacStories, which is Toggle. Doesn't integrate with FreshBooks either. It's just a local app in the sense that you track the time and it syncs between the iPhone and the iPad. They also have a widget. They have an Apple Watch version to start timers more quickly. And it looks fantastic. I mean, the Toggle app on the iPhone is kind of terrible. This one looks so polished. The interface is lovely and you have this goals feature. I mean, if I didn't use Toggle, I would definitely consider Manifest now. Anyway, they have a subscription, which is $3 a month or $25 a year. So you get 3 months free if you subscribe annually. So if you subscribe to Manifest Pro, you get unlimited projects and this feature called the Smart Goals that allows you to see if you're kind of behind or ahead of schedule. You can do fixed length goals. You can customize the export of the app to CSV and you can archive projects. And I think, I was talking to the developer of Manifest, and it's clear how subscriptions make sense for this kind of app, because a time tracker is an app that you commit yourself to. It's an app that you want to keep over time and that you want to make sure that it sticks around. So by paying for the app, not only are you making a commitment. You're saying, okay, I keep all of my data here and it's going to be useful for me to visualize how I tracked my time, say 6 months ago compared to last week. But you're also supporting the ongoing development of the app. So it's a sort of a positively reinforcing loop that the developer makes money, you commit yourself to the app, you get more data, and the app continues to receive more features. It's the more you log your time, the more value you accumulate in the app. You are a pro member, so you have more features, and the app continues to be developed, and everybody's happy. And I think it makes a lot of sense.
The last one that I've got is Radar Scope, and that's a $10 pro weather app with incredibly detailed radar of storms. And if you're a weather geek, this is the kind of app for you, because I was looking at it and it's amazing what this app does. But even at the $10 version of this app isn't all it does, because it for the people who are really, really into this, you can get 2 different subscriptions, either a $10 a year subscription or a $15 a year subscription that adds all sorts of crazy data, most of which I didn't understand. But if you're very very into weather, this would be the right kind of app. And in a way, it reminds me of Zombies Run too, because it's a community of people who are very into the weather and tracking what's happening in their local community. And this is a really great way to do it.
Yeah, looking at these advanced weather apps, I don't understand them either. So every time I look at those maps and those radars, it looks like the world is ending.
It looks like everything's on fire.
Yes, basically. It's like there's a fire everywhere. We're all going to die. But seriously, I actually met one of the developers at WWDC last year. We were talking about Radarscope and how they wanted to do subscriptions. And now it looks like they actually did it. And they have 2 tiers. So if you go to radarscope.io, they have, and it's very cool because they have all of the details. So you can compare the different tiers and then you can subscribe directly on iTunes on the App Store. It's very cool.
So that's not all we discovered. There are, of course, some bigger companies that are doing this too. And just a handful of examples that are worth checking out sometime. And these are ones that you've probably heard us talk about a lot on MacStories in the past, are things like Todoist, which is the task manager that Federico and I both use, 1Password, Evernote, Newton Email, which we just profiled in the Club MacStories newsletter a couple of weeks ago, Box, and Autodesk Sketchbook, which is another drawing application.
Yeah, and all of these companies have switched to the iTunes subscriptions. They were using their own systems before,
right?
Or maybe some of them were kind of faking the subscription by doing in-app purchases, sort of like consumable in-app purchases. You get like 3 months of usage or a year of usage. But now all of these companies have moved to the actual auto-renewable system, which makes it easier for everyone.
Thanks to Mail Butler for sponsoring App Stories this week. No one's ever said I want to spend more time on my email. Mail Butler is a series of Apple Mail add-ons to help you get through your email quickly and efficiently on your Mac. Mail Butler includes email scheduling, beautiful message templates, signature management, easy unsubscribe, and integrations with Evernote and OneNote. The Mail Butler team let me in on a little secret about something they're working on. Well, actually, it's a really big secret. I can't really say more, but keep an eye on Mail Butler's website for more news in the coming months. There's a link in the show notes. Thanks again to Mail Butler for supporting the show.
So we've looked at a bunch of different apps and services doing subscriptions on iTunes now. And I think overall I'm okay with this trend. I know that I wouldn't want to subscribe to a calculator app, or I wouldn't want to subscribe to the utility that I use every couple of months. But for my most favorite apps, I want them to stick around. And I want to make sure that as a regular user, I want to give developers my money. It's like the Futurama meme. I want to give you my money, and I want to make sure that I'm making a contribution to make sure that the app that I use is not going away. And actually, what I've noticed is before I start using a new app, so before I introduce a new app or a new web service in my workflow, now I always go check if there's a subscription or if there's a clear business model that makes sure the developers can stick around and the app is not going away in 2 months. Because I'm at the point where the apps that I commit myself to, I want to make sure I can use them for the longest period of time possible. And I think Apple is doing this right. There should be maybe more flexibility for developers who have a web service component, but I think overall subscriptions, they work well for users, which is what ultimately matters, I think, to make it easier for people to subscribe and to manage their subscriptions. I think that's done relatively well. The bigger picture for a lot of developers going to implement subscriptions, that's a big question. I understand that there's the risk of introducing subscription fatigue. And that's a valid argument. If everybody switches to subscriptions, then does it really make a difference? Are we going back to just doing paid apps because it's easier? So I think there should be a discussion to be had about where subscriptions make sense, how developers should approach the users, and how much users should be picky about what they subscribe to. I don't think subscriptions make sense for any type of app. They make sense for most of those, and especially pro apps. I would like to see Apple now kind of addressing the second part of this story, which is allow developers to write even more powerful apps on iOS, and especially the iPad. Because now that they have the business model, they should also have the incentives to create the desktop class software that people now want on iOS. I think it's been a long time since we've seen features, especially on the iPad, aimed at developers that want to go beyond offering the simple utility or the simple text editor. So now that there's a way to generate more revenue over time from loyal users, there should also be a way to make even more powerful apps. And if that happens, maybe this year, I think it's going to be a nice series of changes to the App Store now that you have desktop class software and a proper way to support your favorite developers of your most powerful and used apps over time.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because what we saw the rise of free games and free apps and very low cost paid upfront apps is we saw apps becoming kind of disposable. And the problem with that is that while a 1.0 might have been a great app and shown a lot of promise, it wasn't always worth it for the developer to take it any further and make it more of a pro app and continue to maintain it. And I think the subscription gives us some hope that there is a sustainable business model and a subscription that will allow developers to continue to develop some of these apps. The thing that concerns me probably most and makes me a little cautious about subscriptions, though, I think, is that I'm not certain that it is going to work for as broad a base of developers as you are, maybe, Federico, because it seems to me that it's more likely to work for the category leaders, the slightly larger teams that have the resources to really put a lot into a heavy-duty pro app. And I just wonder whether that leaves some people behind, the solo developers who have something a little simpler or something that's maybe the number 2 or 3 or 4 app in that category as opposed to the number 1. Well, that's it for this week, everybody. Thanks again to our sponsors, Drafts and Mail Butler. If you're enjoying the show, please head over to iTunes and leave a rating. We'd appreciate that. And you can find both of us writing at macstories.net or Club Mac Stories. Federico is at Viticci on Twitter. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHEES. We will talk to you next week. Bye, Federico.
Ciao, John.